Hi, everyone. We're going to get started in just one more minute.
Can you hear me? This is Linda.
I can.
Oh, good. I'm trying to get the technology running. I'm having some problems.
All right. Welcome, everyone. Hello, and welcome to the monthly NASW Pennsylvania chapter webinar. My name is Joanna Bird, and I'm the executive director with the chapter, sitting in while our staff position is open, for the position that normally runs these calls. This free webinar series is done as a member benefit and is available to members only. Webinars are done each month on the last Wednesday of the month at 12 o'clock p.m. and count for 1 CE credit. And this one counts for 1 ethics credit, so it's even more special. During the webinar, if you have questions, type them into the questions section of the menu on the side. To obtain your CE credit, you must attend a minimum of 50 minutes of this webinar, and our system does track how long that you've been logged in. But let us know if you have any problems with that. After the webinar, if you have attended that minimum 50 minutes, you will receive an email within about 30 minutes to an hour after the webinar is over that will have a link to complete the evaluation. I will also paste that link into the chat section about 5 minutes before the end of the webinar. The certificate will be sent to you via email in a few days. Please note that the certificates are not automatically generated, but will be sent by one of our staff members. So it will take at least a couple of days. So give us that long before you contact us to say that you haven't yet received your certificate, because that's totally 100% normal. All right, now we'd like to go ahead and get started with our presentation. And I will kick us off by introducing our presenters, who will tell you briefly about themselves. We have multiple members of our Committee on Ethics with us today, starting with our chair, Chris Rich.
All right. Thank you, Joanna. I really appreciate that. Appreciate everybody tuning into this. This is our Ethics Roadshow, and we wanted to give you a behind-the-curtains peek at what we do every day in our Ethics Committee. So I'm Chris Rich, and I'm a social worker here at the Milton Hershey School. And I've been a part of the Ethics Committee probably for the past 10 or 11 years now. And it's my pleasure to serve on the Ethics Committee with this fine team. And our goal is to provide high ethics standards and consultation and questions and education for folks. And I'm happy to be here with you today.
All right, next I'd like to introduce Ms. Phyllis Black.
Hello, I'm Phyllis Black, as Joanna said. I, too, am honored to be a member of the Ethics Committee, and I'm looking forward to hearing your voices at this Ethics Roadshow. I'm a faculty member at Marywood University School of Social Work and have responsibility for the campus in the Lehigh Valley.
All right. Next, I'd like to introduce Rich Dimaio.
Yes, how you doing? Welcome, everyone. I have a private practice in Media, Pennsylvania, where I've been in practice for almost 18, 19 years, and been a member of the Ethics Committee for just over 2 years, and I find it quite challenging, quite rewarding, but mainly quite exciting to be part of the Ethics Committee.
All right, Ms. Claire Dante.
Hello, my name is Claire Dante. I'm a professor at Westchester University in the undergraduate social work department. I teach practice courses, family systems, research, policy, pretty much everything. And I have also been on the ethics committee for a few years now and really enjoy everything I learn being on this, as well as on the NASW Brandywine Division Steering Committee.
Right, and finally, Linda Martin.
Oh, hi, this is Linda. I have a practice in Pittsburgh, 23 years. I can't believe that I've been in practice, and I've been on the ethics committee for a couple of years now too. And before that, I was in volunteer positions through NASW when ethical concerns were raised with NASW about members in various different capacities and corrective action. And I've also been appointed to the State Board of Social Work recently and have been volunteering in that position, which of course also hears a lot of legal, ethical cases. And I'm just happy to be here and share together with you.
All right. Thank you. And then as who we're missing from our committee is Lynn Pastor was not able to make it today, nor Ann Abbott or Ruth McNeil Whitaker. And so that makes our committee. So you'll notice that we are social workers among other social workers. So there's nothing special about us. We just volunteered to step forward. And we all have our different expertises and different areas of practice. Me as the chair of the committee, I'm looking for a couple things and for ethics committee members, and that is different ranges of practice. We don't all want to be private practitioners or educators or school social workers, or we know that our schools field, our social work field is very diverse, and so we want to have a diverse group from different areas from geographical areas, from the north to the east to the west to the south, different practice areas and different life experiences as well. So we try to build diversity in our team, and we try to build a team that dedicated folks, and we have a great team together. And so right now, let's talk a little bit about what the NASW Ethics Committee does. So we have a couple different roles. We are a statewide committee, but we're also part of a national process. So when you look at our relationship with NASW, we have the NASW-PA, which has this committee. And we also work hand in hand with the national committee as well. So if there's an ethics complaint or an ethics concern that starts out as a national process, but they look to us as a regional group to help provide the chair, to provide the staff needed to adjudicate that case. So we really see our very most primary role is providing education and training to social workers. So we'd much rather work on the front end of things to help educate folks to what ethical practice is than work on the back end of things if there's ethical concerns, dealing with them after the fact. It's always better to deal with things prior to becoming a problem. And so that's why we're all really active in providing education and training. We provide the newsletter articles. We provide education opportunities for folks in a number of different settings, both in person, and we're really branching out with this online opportunity here as well to have people to ask their ethical questions and get response back from the ethics team. We want to promote quality and effective social work practice, and looking at the Code of Ethics is really the gold standard for that. We also see our job is to protect the public from harmful and unethical practices. So the far majority of social workers practice in the highest ethical standards and with high ethical practices, but there are a few bad actors out there. And so when that's the case, we want to make sure that we're there to respond to the issue and remediate and if necessary discipline practitioners, NASW members when unethical conduct is found. So again, that happens very rarely, but that is a role that we have, and it does come up from time to time as well. Just to give you kind of a little foundation on the NASW Code of Ethics. So we've had several different revisions throughout its history. The most recent one was in August 4th of 2017. The Delegate Assembly approved changes to the new Code of Ethics. And it was really the first change that was been made since 1996. So when you think about what was happening in 96, things have changed quite a bit in social work standards as far as our practice standards, and mostly in the areas of technology. And so the Code of Ethics had been not very responsive to some of those needs. So the NASW recognized that and made changes that went into effect January 1st of 2018. So if you're used to the old Code of Ethics, we'll make sure that you know the new standards and new code and make sure you're following the most current standards. So with the new code, there are 19 new standards involved. It's now 36 pages. And again, since social work is such a diverse field, it's designed to be relevant for all social workers, clinical practice, macro practice, micro practice, and all areas that social workers get involved with. So it has to be very comprehensive. So I'm going to invite folks to turn to click on the link. This link may not work on your computer, but if you click on NASW Code of Ethics in your search engine, you should find that and be able to pull that up as a supplemental resource. So as we talk here, so at the very foundation of everything we talk about, it really kind of is based in the Code of Ethics, and so that's what we'll be using as our standards as we go look at either some ethics cases we've developed for you, or the ethics cases that you have. But we want to make sure that we are kind of answering in accordance with the new Code of Ethics. Outside of technology, there was 2 other minor changes that people just need to be aware of. We've moved away from the area of, it used to be, we used to call it cultural competence. We felt that might be a bit of an overstatement. And so now the new term is cultural awareness. So I think we recognize that nobody can be culturally competent in every single culture and every single kind of situation that comes up. So I think the best we can hope for is developing a sense of cultural awareness. So that was one significant change that wasn't involved with technology. The other thing it changed, there's a word in there around the issue of disability, and they just dropped the disability part, and then ability seems much more kind of inclusive and comprehensive. So that was the other change. Other than that, the changes were mostly in response to how to deal with technology, social media, and the many different things that come up now in practice that wouldn't have come up prior to the last revision of the Code of Ethics. So when we look at the Code of Ethics, there are 6 principles, and we call those our core values, and those are service, social justice, dignity and worth of a person, the importance of human relationships, integrity, and competence. And within that, there are 6 standards. So we have 6 responsibilities, 6 area clusters of responsibility, and the Code of Ethics is framed in each of those 6 areas. So that area 1 will be numbered 1.0, and it will kind of go on from there. And so those areas of responsibility are to clients, to colleagues, to our practice setting as professionals, to the profession of social work in general, and lastly, to broader society. Really, we define ethical dilemmas when there's a clash between those 2. We have 2 competing ethical demands. So we may have a demand to keep confidential information, but we also may have a duty to warn. And so it's when we have a clashing ethical debate is where we get an ethical dilemma, and that's how we have to resolve that. The Code of Ethics doesn't give us a guidebook for that. We need to use our discernment. We need to use consultation. We need to use other methods to come up with that in our best estimation. So with that, I'm going to share a quote from Jane Addams, which I love. It says, action indeed is the sole medium of expression for ethics. And that really our actions speak louder than words, and that our actions every day in caring for clients really is the most kind of obvious expression of our ethical practice every day. With that, I'm going to open it up, and Joanna's going to mediate. We're going to open it up for you to ask any question you want of the committee. If you have questions about the committee, if you have questions about a particular ethical issue, if you have questions about kind of ethics in general, or kind of where you'd like to see things go, or this is our opportunity for that. Joanna will probably not be able to get to every question, but she will definitely get to most that we can. And I'm going to turn it over to the rest of the group, because as you hear, I'm probably losing my voice here a little bit. And we'll begin our question and answer period.
All right, needed to unmute myself for a second. And a quick reminder to our panelists to mute yourselves if you're not, when you're not talking, because we can hear a little bit of feedback coming through the audio and the microphone right now. All right, our first question is, what's the most common ethical violation?
I think committee will take a stab at that.
I can actually address that one a little bit myself because I participate in many of the licensing board meetings. And at one point, it was boundary issues, especially, unethical relationships with clients or former clients. But in recent years, Medicare and insurance fraud took over as the top ethical violation. Did any other committee members want to comment on that?
Chris, do you want to share the slide that you have?
Well, we can
Or do you want to wait?
So why don't we go? So since you asked, actually, why don't we go right into that? So now we have a couple points of data. And as Joanna said, dual relationships had been the #1 carrier for a long time. And these are old numbers. These numbers are very hard to get. But when you look at the slide here, you look at the 3 biggest areas: sexual impropriety, dual relationships, and other boundary violations. That made up for over 50% of the violations. And, so that was certainly that's certainly a huge issue. It's certainly something that the ethics committee struggles with a bit because you can't teach some of these things out of folks. So and I think they're the most obvious ones that you should avoid. But for some reason, people still fall into that trap. I think probably the most one that people struggle with most is the issue of confidentiality. Duty to warn becomes a real sticking point. There's a really great dissection of the Virginia Tech shooting that really kind of broke down to why that happened. And one of the things that noted in there was that there was still a lot of confusion about when to keep information confidential and when to report duty to warn. And so those are the things I see that people struggle with a lot on a day-to-day basis. You'll see other things here like failure to seek supervision, acceptable practice skills, fraudulent behavior, which would fall into the Medicare fraud, premature termination, inadequate transfer of records, inadequate record keeping in general. I think people are generally pretty anxious about records, and that becomes a hot issue, and inadequate informed consent. So again, those numbers are a little old. They were like, I think, ended in 2004. Because what we did is looked at the licensing issues. And so this slide, you'll see a little more relevant information, a little more recent information. So this came from the Pennsylvania Department of Licenses. And so and you'll notice by the number there, Joanna, do you know how many practicing social workers we have in Pennsylvania?
Probably close to 20,000. That's what
I number I would thought too. Okay, so you notice this is from 2013 to 2018. Anybody want to take a guess at what number jumped out to me? So you have 20,000 people over a 5-year period. We have 44 ethics violations. So again, when I talk about people practicing good ethical practices, we are doing that. So that's a very low number. So that's a number I think is very noteworthy. So this slide, the biggest one is you guys are all working on right now is failure to complete CE hours. So ironically enough, those 2 years roll around and people for some reason don't get their CE credits or they're not done in the correct way. So when you get them from NASW, we're a preferred provider and that they'll count at the end of the time. Interesting enough, we talked a lot about practice protection and title protection. People holding themselves to have a social work license without possessing a valid license. I think this is particularly true for a lot of our border state issues. So between New Jersey and Pennsylvania, West Virginia and Pennsylvania, New York and Pennsylvania. So people are practicing on across state lines that shouldn't be. Dual relationships is certainly on there. Violation of terms and conditions of the previous order issues. So so if you're a bad actor, you're not going to straighten yourself up. There's been times where the State Department had to come back in and impose more limits on folks. Again, Medicare fraud's in there, danger to the public safety, and domestic relations. So one of the things you might not know, you might not think too much about it, but when you sign your license, it says you need to be in good moral character, and so there are certain crimes that would preclude you from doing that, and domestic violence, DUI, substance abuse issues, violent crimes, those kind of things would cause licensing issues, and so that is a small subset of that as well.
May I just make an observation about the previous slide that you showed? That was done in the 1980s.
Gotcha. Okay.
What is paradoxical is if you look at the Code of Ethics, there are very few definitive absolutely no-nos or absolutely yes. A clear no-no was no sex with current clients. Most of the other ethical standards come with wiggle room. And Chris mentioned before, I mean, always respect confidentiality, but then there's a caveat. Unless they're compelling professional reasons, imminent, foreseeable, serious danger that would allow you to supersede or to breach confidentiality. I was very pleased to hear that sexual impropriety has gone down the list, because it's really quite paradoxical, as I said, that that is one of the major no-nos, and yet that's in the 80s at least was the most violated. So we as social workers have done much better in that regard, and it seems as if psychologists have now taken over that, I don't know how to characterize it, but that mantle.
All right. We do have a few good questions that have come in, lots of good questions actually, but I'll throw a situation at you. This question is, say you know an MSW colleague is committing insurance fraud and using illicit substances when they are on call for their job. This person is not licensed. Can or should you report this to the licensing board if you believe it's impacting the person's professional competence? There is no evidence that it is impacting client care at present. However, it does impact team dynamics as other social workers are taking more on-call duty as they do not trust this person's decision-making outside of work hours.
Well, there are two standards in the Code of Ethics that relate directly to that. In the section, Chris mentioned that there are 6 clusters of obligations that we have. And in the section related to colleagues, that we as social workers have the obligation, when faced with the unethical conduct of a colleague, to just go face to face and discuss it with them as a first order of business, unless there is some compelling reason that this might not be a good idea. So that your first order of business would be to confront the colleague. If that goes nowhere, then you take it up the chain of command. And if you happen to be the CEO, then it would be appropriate, according to a later standard that suggests that fraud is one of the taboos. You would, at least from my opinion, want to report it. And incidentally, let me just add, and then I'll let somebody else have a go at it, is one of the exciting and frustrating things about the code and about our work as an ethical committee is there often is no one definitive answer, so that people have different opinions, which is what makes the whole discussion more rich. And based on those different opinions, we come to some consensus.
Nicely said, Phyllis, and I would concur with a lot of that. I think a couple of things, that nuances in the question that I think bear some discussion. First is, again, if you look at the section, it's 2.08, 09, and 10. And 08 is impairment of colleagues, 9 is incompetence of colleagues, and 10 is unethical conduct of colleagues. So it sounds like they've reached all 3 of those in different levels. One of the interesting points about the caller's question is that should they contact the licensing board? which is interesting because I think they said that the person's not licensed. So knowing who to call sometimes can be a real issue. So if you contact the licensing board and they're not a licensed social worker, then you probably won't get very far. They'll probably send you someplace else. So depending on the type of agency and the type of kind of contract work or the type of responsibilities they have, there usually are reporting processes within that system. If they're an NSW member, you can certainly report it to NASW, and we would, and that would come before this committee. If they're not an NASW member, then again, you would want to rely on local authorities. Again, as Phyllis talked about, you want to start with the colleague and the agency, and then if you're not getting the response that you want from there, then you work out from there. But yeah, we do have to address this. So sounds like everyone's kind of walking around. And someone's got their phone ringing, and that that it does need to be addressed. That if everybody kind of is worried about assigning a client to that person, then I would say that's impacting client care.
Yep. All right. Thank you, guys. One more question. In a rural setting, I find the duality of relationship tricky as professional social circles are small. Is it unethical to have crossover if there is no direct friendship relationship?
Well, let's take a stab at this one. Linda?
Can you repeat the question? The crossover, they're talking about conflict of interest. Is that just?
Yeah, basically they're talking about dual relationships in rural settings, and how to navigate that when you inevitably have have some level of dual relationships in small communities.
Yeah, I think that it gets very tricky when there's a limited number of social workers available. The problem with conflict of interest and dual relationships, it is a conflict of interest, is about the potential for the client or the patient to be taken advantage of. And so it requires, just even a higher level of awareness of any type of meeting the social worker's needs instead of meeting the client's needs, and just really being observant and maintaining, the best boundaries that you can, and may require, some extra level of sacrifice, and relationships too, trying not to overstep boundaries and social groupings and that sort of thing. So we live within our reality of the environment that we are working in. I think we have to live within that reality.
I really like that language, Linda. We live within the reality, and appreciate the question a lot, because it is really challenging to work in a rural community and hone absolutely true to the code of ethics, and particularly the dual relationships, because it would not be uncommon for your kids to be in the same class at school. I mean, this can happen, and actually we did some research, and this happened very frequently. So how do you deal with that? Do you take your kid and put her in another school? No, because as social workers, as much as we kind of subjugate our own needs to those of the clients, I mean, we have a life as well. So what we found was the preferable approach is to be proactive, to discuss whenever it's possible that in your rural community, when you're working with a client, you begin by saying, look, your husband may be my dentist. It's the only dentist in town, and I'm the only social work in town. How should we manage this? And then you work out a plan for management, and more critically, you check in periodically. How is this plan working?
I would agree with Phyllis and just say I think that falls under the informed consent piece.
I'm sorry, it's me.
Can you repeat that, Claire?
Oh, sure. I was just saying, just to kind of affirm what Phyllis was saying, that it falls under informed consent and being the proactive, taking the proactive element into play.
While we're on dual relationships, I have a follow-up question asking about dual relationships. Does that also apply between the supervisor and supervisee relationship?
In a rural setting?
Not necessarily. I think that one was just, I guess, would it be appropriate to be, close friends, to be in a romantic relationship, whatever, or other, or like coworker or other dual relationships between supervisors and supervisees?
I guess I would distinguish if it's a student or it's an employee. If you have an intern makes a difference, then to me, maybe I'm wrong, but.
Yep. And Joanna, so I would say it applies to the Code of Ethics, but a different section of the Code of Ethics. So we look at dual relationships regarding client social worker. That would be in 1.06, and that would be point C in particular. And just to make a kind of point about that is that it doesn't say we can't have dual relationships, but it says that we should avoid dual relationships. But where we can avoid them, we manage them. And so then we use things that Linda and Phyllis talked about. So if we're going to go back to more of a employer-employee relationship, kind of supervisory, then we look at section 3. So there are sections in there about what the responsibilities our social workers are as supervisors, and how do we avoid dual relationships there. So we look at 3.01. It said social workers should not engage in any dual or multiple relationship with supervisees in which there is risk of exploitation or potential harm to the supervisory, including dual relationships that may arise while using social network sites or other electronic media. So I'd say to that is that there's nothing wrong with being friends, being friendly at work, but there certainly is a professional boundaries that we need to maintain, and that especially if we have supervisory roles, we need to understand that role is larger than the friendship or a kind of a personal relationship with any one person we're responsible for. Because remember, it's not only between you and that person, but it's also the perception of the rest of the folks. So if they see one person hanging out with a supervisor all the time in their office after work, having a lot of inside jokes, a lot of inside stories, that can create a real kind of toxic environment where they say, oh yeah, they're just doing that because they're friends with the boss. And so not only do you have to manage that relationship, but you have to understand your responsibility to manage a team, and that when you manage a team, you need to make sure that you're fair, impartial, and making sure you give everybody their due.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is Linda. The relationships are so different. Our relationship with clients and our relationship with supervisees or supervisors. But as developing professionals, the supervisor relationship is such an important modeling, ethical behavior, and it can be just as devastating to have breaches in the supervisor-supervisee relationship as it is for client practitioner social worker relationships, and so they are really important. And supervisors have a special responsibility, I think, because we're modeling and helping the new professionals grow and understand ethical practice.
Oh,
All right. While we're on the topic of supervision, we have another question come in related to supervision that I think would be a good one for us to address. That is specific to a circumstance where an LSW is working with an LCSW for licensure. And I believe is contracting outside of the agency for to receive their supervision. So if the LSW is, for example, witnessing unethical behavior at their place of employment, and you as the supervisor recommend reporting up the chain and and addressing that unethical behavior, and the supervisee decides it would make her a target and decides not to follow that recommendation. So having made a recommendation on that course of action, what do you do if your supervisee chooses not to follow that recommendation other than addressing that during supervision?
Yeah, this is Linda. It is one of the difficulties of the supervision being located outside the agency, and some of the difficulties in guiding the behavior within the agency, which a external supervisor just doesn't have, that type of ability, because they're not employed there to, assist or to help or to move things along. Supervisors do have within their responsibilities, because they are ultimately also responsible for the care of the patient, for the client, to discuss it with the supervisee, and if they think it's a serious enough situation, if we're talking about something that is really causing serious harm, then the supervisor has the right to say that they don't think that they can supervise if the supervisee is not being a little bit more proactive. It's a really difficult situation.
I would certainly concur with that. I think there's something called vicarious liability, and us as supervisors have a responsibility for those that we're supervising. And so the question is, if unethical behavior or illegal behavior or bad treatment or whatever it is happens, then the supervisor the question is, did they know or should they have known? And so if you're doing your job as a supervisor, you do have a responsibility to to be aware of issues as they arise, to not only advise when we feel like we need to, but also what could be the next action. So this could be a great teaching moment for that student, and helping to kind of understand what the level of seriousness is of it, what the implications are, and what her options are. And it could get to the point where Linda says that either that supervisor needs to take action, or they maybe need to say that we need to terminate the relationship. You're not following with what I would see as best practice, and that I can't continue to supervise it in the situation. So so it all depends on the level of seriousness of the behavior, the level of risk it has to somebody else, and the the foreseen danger that might happen with that if it's not addressed.
Hey, Chris, this is Rich. I'd like to add to that this is something you need to take a little slower and not be proactive. But as we were talking about, letting the supervisee let it be a teachable moment, learning, but let them come back with some feedback that they could tell you how they're really feeling. And you can then give them some redirection in such a way that you do with clients many times, without imposing your own values at that time. However, if it has to be escalated, it will be, just by the nature of you as a supervisor taking the lead role and not letting it get out of hand.
I am a firm believer that as social workers, we have to have moral courage. And that's very nice for me to say as someone who is in a university and not in the trenches. But if we see behavior that is harmful to the well-being of the individual or even the community, there's something we have to do. What that something is, I don't know. But I do also know that it takes enormous courage because, as many of you probably know, being a whistleblower, often you end up in a place where you don't want to be. But I don't think we can stand by. We need to stand up and make sure that we follow what our mission is as social workers to enhance individual and community well-being. So have that moral courage.
Great. All right. I've got several more questions. And I know at some point we may want to wrap it up. So if you can give me a heads up when when you think you're ready for your last question. But until then, we had one comment that I think is very helpful. So I'm going to go ahead and read that out. Back when we were talking about unlicensed practitioners and insurance fraud, they noted that agencies and insurance providers, especially Medicaid and Medicare, have prescribed reporting procedures as well. So that's one additional place to go to other than your agency, that you can report insurance fraud directly to the insurance providers, and they would have a Bureau of Provider Integrity to anonymously report fraud and abuse if they believe that retaliation by the perpetrator is an issue. So I did think that was helpful. One other question that came in was about the issue of clients giving spurious complaints about licensed social workers as as revenge or just out of anger, etc. How does the board or how does the ethics committee identify and handle complaints like that?
This is Linda, and I've seen both in NASW and at the board these kinds of complaints come in, and sometimes it's recognized and sometimes it's not, and I think we can do a better job. That we want, of course, to protect the public, but sometimes the social workers do need to have someone protecting them too. And it certainly does happen that there are clients who have these types of difficulties in their personalities and characters, and absolutely will seek revenge. And I think both NASW and the state board can do a better job at really recognizing it, and there's progress, I can say, being made on that. I think there's progress being made.
Well, we've had not quite a few, but we've had a few such cases in the ethics committee. And Chris mentioned earlier that part of our responsibility was adjudication. And we're out there to protect both the clients and the public, and as Linda said, the social worker. And through adjudication, generally, we can come to some understanding that it is a spurious complaint. Nothing that you can do about the client. And I think most frequently, the complaint, again, had to do with the accusation of sexual impropriety. And second to that, related, in fact, is in custody cases, which are really doozers. You'll often find complaints like that. But adjudication, we usually can get to the bottom of it.
I think even before that, I think the intake committee you need to demonstrate there was an ethical breach, and that intake committee. And Rich, you sat on a couple intake committees where it didn't go any farther. They shared the case, and that if it didn't have an ethics violation, if they weren't a member, there was something wrong with the complaint, then it doesn't go any farther than that.
Yeah.
As a follow-up question,
two separate cases. Yeah. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Rich.
No, I was just going to add to that, because in the two cases I was involved with, they were both extreme. One was definitely a revenge motive, and the committee, not just this committee, the committee nationally, they actually saw right through that, right from the beginning. So there is some merit. Sadly, it had to go that far, but the other one was definitely not favorable towards the social worker. It was a clear violation. Sorry.
I was just wondering, this is Joanna, but I was just wondering if you guys had any advice for social workers who may be going through that kind of situation of dealing with a spurious complaint in their in their practice, and how to kind of maintain their own ethical boundaries and demeanor when you're facing that kind of threat to your practice.
That's a great question. My first response would be don't let yourself get pushed around by your client. So they start kind of making threats that they're going to sue, or they're going to do this or that, or they're going to have your license. You just need to keep your head about you. Take a deep breath, kind of understand you're doing the best practice. Don't let them get you off your game, because if they ask you to do something, I'm going to ask you to, you need to do this, or, I'm asking you to, you better tell somebody to do that, or I'm going to, I'm going to get the licensing board involved. Don't fall for those kind of tricks. And so make sure your documentation is good and clear. Make sure you have good standards about your documentation. Document what you did. Document why you did it. If there are ethical issues involved, you could certainly seek consultation either from the national committee or the state committee. And then that can go in your documentation too. So one of the things, I sought consultation on this issue, and this is a response I get back. And so you want to make sure you're documenting kind of what your response is to the situation. If there's something brewing, sometimes you get at a left gear too. Most of the time, they're going to be blustery. They're going to be kind of either asking you to do something or not to do something that they feel is in their best interest. You need to stay what you feel is in your best practice interest, and stick with that, and don't allow yourself to, because you will get yourself into trouble if you start making exceptions, or try to kind of appease them for a bit, and then try to wind it back in at a later time.
Yeah, I support everything that you say, Chris, and especially the documentation, because definitely if you're sued, they're going to want your records and have a right to them. Mostly, I think that sometimes I know can be contested too. The other thing I advise is if you know that the client is serious about suing and wanting to retaliate, get a consultation with your liability insurer. They are very, very helpful. And if you don't have an attorney who is knowledgeable in these sorts of issues, usually your insurance can help you find one, or search, ask colleagues, and get legal advice, because this is it's a serious threat to your license, to your livelihood, when these sort of complaints are made. So you really need to get legal advice right away. Right away. Don't wait.
I would also add, in terms of self-care when you're in practice, especially if you're by yourself, it's good to have a peer support group or a peer supervision group, which can be, doesn't have to be in person. So if you're in a rural area, there's still options with that, which can help kind of be on the proactive side of, if you're sensing issues with a client, to get feedback, consultation, from the clinical end. Self-care is not just taking a hot bath at night, right? It's having good, knowledgeable supports in place as well.
It's a very good point.
Okay.
Claire, that's a very good point.
Okay. With about 10 minutes left, I've got two big questions. One that I think makes a really good summary. But before that, we've had multiple questions come in that I'm going to kind of lump together here about recommendations about electronic records, wireless transfer of information, keeping all of that ethical. The changes that were made in 2017 related to technology and the code of ethics, and just general questions about electronic issues.
That's a great question, and I think that is our challenge moving into the new century here in social work is how to secure your records in a way that's legitimate. So at the end of the night, I can lock my file cabinet up, and I know unless somebody breaks in and steals my keys, and they're going to be kept safe. We have very little reassurance when it comes to electronic documentation about where the information is going, who can have access to it. The big news story is that the entire city of Baltimore has fallen prey to a ransomware virus. The Department of Records, the Department of Statistics, the fire department, every single section has been kind of compromised. And there's been hospitals that have fallen prey to ransomware. The city of Atlanta. So this is a real threat, and something that is not taught in social work school. Is that right, Claire and Phyllis?
Oh, well, we're teaching it. We're teaching it right now because of the new code of ethics.
Yes.
But I think what is paramount here is the whole notion of informed consent.
Yes.
So again, I'm an upfront, proactive person that at the very start of whatever kind of contact you have with client systems, that they are informed about the benefits of using electronic media and also the risks, because nothing is unhackable. So you can use encryption, you can use passwords, you get into the whole thing about posting. Should you go on a dating site to find your true love? Or there's just so much stuff. And I think the best way is informed consent, so that everybody knows what some of the difficulties are. And tomorrow there's going to be a new technology. So it's like painting a moving train. We can really never keep up, except I think we have to come to the realization is that there is no safe way of using digital devices. And we need to tell this to our clients. I mean, there are safeguards that you can use, but in the end, I mean, the Russians will come and hack it.
Hmm.
A couple things you want to look at for your encryption. You want to look for, HIPAA's got some real nice standards in there. So you may decide that you are or not HIPAA compliant or HIPAA entity. And so it's important to establish that. But either way, they have some good kind of gold standards about how to keep electronic records, and the systems have to be kind of at least secured by that. A couple areas I see people falling into is that they might use Google Drive or Google Docs or Google something or other to keep records of different sorts or share information with each other. So that's generally not HIPAA compliant and not recommended and very insecure. So wherever you keep your files, you want to make sure that what safeguards they have in place. Talk to whoever the manufacturer that is. Get a sense for what they do to keep your information private and protected, where it's stored, how it's stored, who has access to it. So those are all questions you need to be asking yourself. And as Phyllis said, being informing as far as the informed consent to the clients.
Oh, and I think the main thing, I talked about informed consent. The other ethical standard that's really critical is competence. And that has to do with our own competence, that I myself am guilty of not really understanding all the different social media platforms that are out there. And we do have an obligation to become competent in terms of what digital devices and social media are out and being used by our clients and being used by ourselves as well.
All right. A note to attendees that the evaluation has been posted in the chat section, and that, but that we'll also be sending that out in a follow-up email that will come out within about 30 minutes to an hour. But then my last question for our group, which I thought was a really good wrap-up question, is, hello, can you share what resources are available from NASW if we have a particular ethical question that we want to run by someone? Is the committee or someone else at NASW available for us to touch base with to broach a question? And if so, who should we contact and how does that process work?
That's a great question. So I'll take that one. So as part of being an NASW members, you have access to the National Ethics Committee, and that number is on top there. So it's an 800 number. I believe they do it on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 10 to 1 on Tuesdays and 10 to 4 on Thursdays. So, or I'm sorry, so 1 to 4 on Thursdays. And so they can certainly give you a response. They're not going to give you kind of the answer to the question, but they'll give you the ethical issues to consider as you're answering the question. Likewise, this committee here is available to you. We don't have an instant response, but what would happen is that you would call into the office and talk with Joanna or one of the staff there. They would send that to our committee in the form of an email with no names or no kind of people attached to it. We would debate it and get back to Joanna, and she would be able to get back to you. That's about a week or 2 week process. If you have something more urgent, then Joanna could make sure you get in touch with somebody in a more immediate fashion. Again, we can give you kind of what the ethical issues are, but we can't give you legal advice, and we can't give you, that this is that answer A is your correct answer.
Unless you're having sex with your client.
Unless that'll be the one exception.
Or committing Medicaid fraud, yeah.
Good point. Thank you, Phyllis. Some questions are easier to answer than others.
All right. Well, I think this has been a wonderful discussion. With just a couple of minutes left, are there any closing thoughts?
I want to thank you, Joanna and Chris, for making this happen, and for all the participants, and of course, all of the committee. I think it's a great idea to have these ethics and all the webinars. It's new for me, and I've really enjoyed it. I hope everyone else has.
I want to particularly thank the participants. I wish I could see you, because I'm really impressed with the quality of your questions And it says to me that you have ethics on your radar screen. And that is probably the most important thing. If you're looking at your work situation through an ethical lens, this is really quite the way to go about being a competent ethical practitioner. So thank you for giving me faith
Right.
in your interest in ethics.
Mhm.
For me, we need to tolerate ambiguity. So our committee doesn't always come up with a one conclusive answer. So there are differences that reasonable minds can come up with in any ethical issue, except for the sleeping with your client question. So we do need to tolerate some ambiguity in this, that oftentimes the answer is a bit nuanced. A couple of things that we need to be, maintain our self-awareness, our cultural awareness, understand the cultural impact and our behavior and others. As Claire mentioned, self-care is so important. So I don't think we could talk about ethics without talking about self-care. And lastly, understanding the difference between law and ethics, because they can be the same, but they can also be different. And understand what the legal responsibilities are and what your ethical responsibilities are is really important.
All right, with that, thanks to everyone for joining us. Again, that evaluation link is in the chat. I'll leave that up for a few minutes, and we'll be sending out a follow-up email in about half an hour to an hour, and then your certificates will be following in within a few days. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us. And then next month, we'll have something coming up on dealing with self-care and caregiving issues with Santo Marbella. All right, thanks everyone, and goodbye.
All right,
Thank you,
thanks, Joanna.
Joanna.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.
Bye.